In the quiet darkness of a summer night in 1961, a young engineer named Michael Chen sat on the roof of his apartment building in Houston, Texas, looking up at the moon. It hung there like a pearl in the velvet sky, serene and unreachable, casting its gentle silver light across the sleeping city below. Michael had always loved the moon. As a child, he would spend hours gazing at it through his father's old telescope, tracing the shadows of its craters and seas, imagining what it would be like to stand on that distant surface and look back at Earth. The air was warm and still, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden below. Michael lay back on the blanket he had brought up with him, his hands folded behind his head, and let himself drift into a peaceful contemplation. The moon had been a constant companion throughout his life. When he was nervous before exams, he would look at the moon. When he missed his family, he would look at the moon. When he fell in love for the first time, he had pointed at the moon and promised his sweetheart that one day humans would walk there. That promise seemed both impossible and inevitable now. Just weeks ago, President Kennedy had made his famous declaration that America would send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. The words had stirred something deep in Michael's heart, a rekindling of childhood wonder mixed with adult determination. He had immediately applied for a position at the newly expanded space program, and to his amazement and joy, he had been accepted. Tomorrow would be his first day at the Manned Spacecraft Center. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey that might, if he was fortunate enough and worked hard enough, lead him to become part of the greatest adventure in human history. But tonight, he simply wanted to be still, to absorb the peaceful presence of the moon and let it fill him with calm certainty. The moon had been Earth's companion for billions of years, silently orbiting, gently pulling the tides, marking the passage of time for countless generations of humans who had gazed up at it in wonder. Poets had written about it, lovers had sighed beneath it, farmers had planted by it, and children had wished upon it. And now, in this moment of history, humanity was reaching out to touch it, to visit it, to walk upon its ancient surface. Michael thought about all the people who would have to work together to make this dream a reality. Engineers and mathematicians, doctors and geologists, seamstresses who would sew spacesuits and technicians who would build rocket engines, programmers who would write code, and astronauts who would risk their lives. Thousands of people, each contributing their small part to something monumentally large, something that would unite humanity in achievement and wonder. The thought was both humbling and inspiring. Michael felt himself relaxing deeply, the tensions of the day melting away like morning mist. His breathing slowed and deepened, matching the peaceful rhythm of the night around him. A gentle breeze stirred the air, cool and refreshing, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the soft hooting of an owl. He imagined the first astronauts who would make this journey. They would sit atop a tower of fire, riding a controlled explosion into the sky, leaving Earth behind to venture into the cosmic ocean. They would float weightless through the void, watching Earth shrink to the size of a marble, then a pearl, then a bright blue star in the darkness. They would feel the strange pull of the moon's gravity, so much gentler than Earth's. As their spacecraft fell into orbit, around that silent companion. And then, in a moment that would echo through all of human history, they would descend. The lunar module would fire its engine, slowing their fall, and they would drop gently, carefully, toward the gray surface below. They would see the ancient mountains and the broad plains, the sharp shadows and the bright highlights. They would feel their hearts racing with excitement and fear and wonder as the ground rose up to meet them. Michael's eyes grew heavy as he imagined it. The soft voice of mission control in their headsets, calm and professional, calling out altitude and velocity. The tense concentration of the astronauts, their hands steady on the controls despite the adrenaline coursing through their veins. The final seconds as the landing legs extended, as the lunar surface filled their windows, as the engine kicked up dust that sparkled in the harsh sunlight. And then, contact. The gentle bump as the spacecraft settled onto the moon, the engine shutting down, the sudden, profound silence after the roar of the descent. And in that silence, the realization they had done it after millions of years of dreaming, after centuries of science and decades of work. Humans had finally reached the moon. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the manned spacecraft center, painting golden rectangles on the polished floors. Michael walked through the corridors with a sense of wonder, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast spaces. Everything here was dedicated to a single purpose, a single magnificent obsession, reaching the moon and returning safely home. He was assigned to the Life Support Systems team, a group of talented engineers who would design the equipment that would keep astronauts alive in the hostile vacuum of space. It was intricate work, demanding absolute precision and creativity in equal measure. Every system had to have backups, and the backups had to have backups. Nothing could be left to chance when human lives hung in the balance. The days blended into each other, each one filled with calculations and tests, meetings and revisions. Michael found himself working alongside brilliant people from all walks of life. There was Sarah, a mathematician who could solve equations that made his head spin, always with a gentle smile and infinite patience. There was James, an older engineer who had worked on aircraft during the war and now brought his hard-won wisdom to the challenge of spaceflight. There was young Patricia, fresh from university, whose innovative thinking often unlocked problems that had stumped everyone else. They worked long hours, but there was a sense of purpose that made the exhaustion feel meaningful. During lunch breaks, they would sometimes walk outside and look up at the daytime sky, finding the pale ghost of the moon hanging there, and they would feel renewed determination. That distant world was waiting for them, patient and eternal. The program moved forward in stages, each one building upon the last. First came the Mercury missions, small capsules carrying single astronauts on brief flights into space. Michael watched the launches with his heart in his throat, marveling at the courage of the men who rode those rockets into the unknown. Each successful mission was celebrated throughout the facility. Each setback was analyzed with meticulous care to prevent it from happening again. Then came Gemini, with two-person crews learning the skills they would need for the lunar voyage. The astronauts practiced spacewalks, floating outside their capsules, tethered by slim lines, learning to work in the strange environment of microgravity. They practiced rendezvous and docking, bringing two spacecraft together in orbit with a precision that seemed almost magical. They stayed in space for longer and longer periods, proving that humans could survive the journey to the moon and back. Michael's work became increasingly specialized. He focused on the environmental control systems that would regulate temperature, humidity, and air pressure inside the spacecraft. It was like designing a tiny, portable Earth, a bubble of life that could survive in the deadly vacuum of space. Every component had to be lightweight, yet robust, simple, yet reliable. It was a puzzle that required not just technical skill, but also intuition and imagination. The years passed with a strange quality, moving both quickly and slowly at once. Each day was full of immediate challenges and small victories. Yet, when Michael looked back, he was amazed at how much time had gone by and how much they had accomplished. The program had grown from a bold dream into a massive undertaking involving hundreds of thousands of people across the country. There were dark days, too. In January 1967, 3 astronauts died in a fire during a routine test on the launch pad. The entire space program mourned, and for a time, it seemed possible that the dream might die with them. But the astronauts' colleagues insisted that the best way to honor their sacrifice was to continue the mission, to learn from the tragedy, and build something safer and better. Michael threw himself into the redesign efforts with renewed dedication. The spacecraft was improved in countless ways, with safer materials, better escape systems, and more thorough testing procedures. It was painful, painstaking work, but it was necessary. The astronauts who would fly to the moon trusted them with their lives, and that trust could not be taken lightly. As 1968 dawned, the pieces were finally coming together. The massive Saturn V rocket, taller than a skyscraper and more powerful than anything ever built, had completed its test flights. The command module, where the astronauts would spend most of their journey, had been perfected through the lessons learned from tragedy. The lunar module, the delicate spacecraft that would actually land on the moon, was nearing completion. In December of that year, Apollo 8 made history by carrying humans to the moon for the first time, not to land, but to orbit, to see the far side that no human eye had ever witnessed, to watch Earth rising over the lunar horizon like a blue jewel in the cosmic darkness. Michael watched the television coverage with tears streaming down his face, overcome by the beauty and significance of what he was witnessing. The astronauts read from the book of Genesis as they orbited the moon on Christmas Eve, their voices crackling across the vast distance, and billions of people around the world listened in wonder. For a moment, all of humanity seemed united in appreciation of the miracle that we exist at all, that we live on this beautiful planet, that we can reach out across the void and touch other worlds. Now it was 1969, and everything was ready for the final attempt. Apollo 11 would carry 3 astronauts to the moon, and 2 of them would descend to the surface. The crew had been chosen: Neil Armstrong, a quiet, focused commander who had narrowly escaped death as a test pilot; Buzz Aldrin, a brilliant engineer with a sharp mind and fierce determination; and Michael Collins, who would pilot the command module and wait in orbit while his colleagues made history below. Michael Chen watched the preparations with a mixture of pride and nervousness. So much could go wrong. There were thousands of potential failure points, any one of which could turn triumph into tragedy. But there was also something else he felt, something harder to name, a sense of rightness, as if this moment had been written in the stars from the beginning of time, as if all of human history had been leading to this point. The morning of July 16th, 1969, dawned hot and humid over Cape Kennedy in Florida. Michael had traveled there to watch the launch in person, along with hundreds of thousands of other people who had converged on the coast to witness history. The beaches and roads were packed with humanity, all facing the same direction, all waiting for the same moment. The Saturn V rocket stood on its launch pad like a monument to human ambition, white and gleaming in the early sunlight, venting oxygen that turned to wisps of vapor in the warm air. It was impossibly tall, impossibly large, and yet the three men inside the tiny capsule at its tip seemed impossibly brave. Michael thought about what it must feel like to sit there, strapped in, knowing that in a few hours you would either be on your way to the moon or you would be dead. The countdown proceeded with mechanical precision, each second ticked off by the public affairs officer whose calm voice belied the tension everyone felt. Michael stood with his colleagues, shading his eyes against the bright sun, watching the rocket from miles away. Even at this distance, it dominated the landscape, impossible to ignore, impossible to look away from. At Mission Control in Houston, hundreds of engineers sat at their consoles, monitoring every aspect of the spacecraft and rocket. Each person was responsible for one small piece of the puzzle, but together they formed a collective mind watching over the mission. The flight director, a serious man with the weight of the world on his shoulders, polled his team one final time. Go, go, go. Every system was ready. The final seconds of the countdown seemed to stretch into eternity. 10, 9, 8. Michael held his breath without realizing it. 7, 6, 5. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. 4, 3, 2. The massive engines at the base of the rocket ignited, and even from miles away, the flame was blindingly bright. 1, 0. The rocket seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if gathering its strength, and then it began to rise. Slowly at first, so slowly that it seemed impossible something so massive could move at all. But rise it did, climbing on a pillar of fire, faster and faster, the sound of the engines reaching the spectators seconds later like the roar of 1,000 thunderstorms. Michael felt the vibration in his chest, felt it in his bones, felt tears streaming down his face as he watched the rocket arc gracefully into the sky. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. All around him, people were crying, laughing, cheering, praying. Strangers hugged each other and shouted with joy. For this brief moment, everyone was united in hope and wonder. The rocket disappeared into the clouds, then emerged again, now just a bright point of light trailing a plume of exhaust. Michael watched until it was gone from sight, knowing that the astronauts were being pressed back into their seats by 3 times the force of gravity, knowing that they were riding the edge of controlled chaos, knowing that thousands of things were happening every second that had to go exactly right. Inside the spacecraft, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were experiencing something few humans had ever known. The vibration, the noise, the crushing acceleration, the knowledge that they were sitting atop a barely controlled explosion, But they had trained for years for this moment. They monitored their instruments, called out readings, kept their voices steady and professional, even as their bodies were subjected to forces that pushed the limits of human endurance. 11 minutes after launch, the third stage of the Saturn V shut down and fell away. And suddenly, the astronauts were weightless, floating in their seats, held only by their harnesses. They had reached orbit. The first phase of the mission was complete. Michael, watching the mission status boards being updated in the viewing center, felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had made it off the ground. They were safe, at least for the moment. The spacecraft circled the Earth 1.5 times, the astronauts checking systems and preparing for the next critical moment. Below them, the world turned, beautiful and serene, the continents and oceans passing by in a stately dance. They could see the curve of the horizon, the thin blue line of the atmosphere, the infinite blackness of space beyond. Then came the moment of truth. The third stage engine would fire again, accelerating them to escape velocity, the speed needed to break free of Earth's gravitational embrace. This was called trans-lunar injection, and it would commit them to the journey. There would be no turning back until they swung around the moon. The engine fired right on schedule, and the astronauts felt themselves pressed back into their couches once more. For 6 minutes, the engine burned, adding thousands of miles per hour to their velocity, sending them arcing away from Earth toward the moon. When it shut down, they were on their way, falling through space on a trajectory that had been calculated with exquisite precision. Michael Collins separated the command module from the spent rocket stage, turned it around, and docked with the lunar module that had been stored below. It was a delicate maneuver that had to be performed perfectly, and Collins executed it with the skill of the test pilot he was. With a satisfying clunk, the two spacecraft joined together. They were now configured for the lunar voyage, a strange-looking assemblage of metal and insulation and dreams. The astronauts settled in for the 3-day journey to the moon. They ate their space food, performed their scheduled tasks, spoke with mission control, and took turns sleeping. They also spent long hours simply looking out the windows, watching Earth recede behind them and the moon grow larger ahead. It was a perspective that changed them, that changed everyone who has ever seen it. Earth looked so small, so fragile, so precious, floating in the infinite darkness. All of human history had happened on that little blue marble, and now 3 of its children were venturing away from it for the first time. The spacecraft drifted through the void in a strange silence. Outside, there was no air to carry sound, nothing but the absolute quiet of the vacuum. Inside, the astronauts could hear the hum of fans, the gurgle of coolant pumps, the occasional click and beep of equipment. These were comforting sounds, the sounds of systems working as they should, the sounds of the tiny bubble of life that protected them from the hostile universe beyond the thin metal walls. Neil Armstrong floated near the main window watching the stars. They didn't twinkle out here without an atmosphere to distort their light. They were steady, sharp points of brilliance scattered across the blackness. He had been an aviator his entire adult life, but this was different from any flying he had ever done. There was no air rushing past, no engine straining against gravity. They were simply falling through space, following the invisible curve of Newton's laws toward their distant destination. Buzz Aldrin was reviewing the procedures for the lunar landing, going over the checklists one more time, even though he had memorized them long ago. He was a man who believed in preparation, in understanding every detail, in being ready for anything that might happen. The lunar module, which they had nicknamed Eagle, was a strange craft, all angles and foil and spindly legs. It looked fragile, and in a way it was, but it had been designed with great care and tested extensively. It would do its job if they did theirs. Michael Collins, who would remain in orbit while his colleagues descended to the moon, floated through the tunnel connecting the command module to the lunar module, checking systems and making sure everything was secure. He sometimes felt like he had drawn the short straw, that he would come all this way only to circle above while history was made below. But he understood the importance of his role. Someone had to pilot the command module, had to be ready to rescue his colleagues if something went wrong with the lunar module, had to ensure they had a way to get home. It was an awesome responsibility, and he bore it with quiet dignity. The three men had trained together for months, learning to work as a seamless team. They had sat in simulators for countless hours, practicing normal procedures and emergency procedures, dealing with every malfunction the trainers could think of. They had studied geology so they would know what to look for on the moon. They had exercised to keep their bodies strong. They had said goodbye to their families, holding their wives and children close, not speaking the fear that they might never see each other again. Now, halfway to the moon, they allowed themselves to relax slightly. The trajectory was good. The systems were functioning perfectly. There was nothing to do but wait and drift and think. They took turns describing what they saw through the windows, their voices recorded for posterity, trying to find words adequate to capture the profound experience of leaving Earth behind. "The Earth is very beautiful," Collins radioed down to mission control at one point. The understatement was typical of the astronauts, trained to be calm and professional at all times. But beneath the steady voice, there was wonder. Earth from this distance was a living jewel, blue and white and brown, wreathed in swirling clouds. They could see an entire hemisphere at once, could watch weather systems develop, could trace the coastlines of continents. It was a view that made national boundaries seem absurd, that made human conflicts seem petty, that made the unity of life on Earth seem obvious and precious. The moon grew larger day by day, hour by hour. At first, it was just a bright disk, not much different from how it looked from Earth. But gradually, they could begin to make out details. The dark patches called seas, though there was no water in them, just ancient lava flows that had filled vast impact basins billions of years ago. The bright highlands, battered by eons of meteorite impacts, covered in craters within craters within craters. As they approached, the moon ceased to look like a distant object and began to feel like a place, a world, with its own geography, its own landscapes, its own alien beauty. The astronauts took photographs, hundreds of them, trying to capture what they were seeing, even though they knew no photograph could truly convey the experience. They were not just observers anymore. They were travelers arriving at a destination, On the third day of the journey, the spacecraft fired its engine to slow down and fall into orbit around the moon. The astronauts felt the gentle push of deceleration, felt the moon's gravity take hold of them. When the engine shut down, they were circling just 60 miles above the surface, close enough to see boulders and small craters, close enough to feel like they could reach out and touch it. They orbited several times, Armstrong and Aldrin scanning the landing site, making sure it looked suitable. From orbit, it was hard to tell exactly what the terrain would be like up close, but it appeared to be relatively smooth, a flat plain that should be safe for landing. The site was called the Sea of Tranquility, named centuries ago by astronomers who thought the dark patches on the moon might be bodies of water. It was a peaceful name for a place humans were about to visit for the first time. The time came for Armstrong and Aldrin to move into the lunar module. They floated through the tunnel, pulling themselves hand over hand in the weightlessness, leaving Collins alone in the command module. They closed the hatches, sealing themselves into Eagle, and began their final preparations. They donned their bulky spacesuits, working methodically through the checklist, helping each other with the complex fastenings and connections. Collins backed the command module away, giving them room. Eagle hung there in space, looking impossibly delicate against the gray vastness of the moon below. Armstrong fired the reaction control thrusters, small jets that spun the lunar module around so its landing engine pointed forward. Everything was ready. They radioed down to Earth, their voices crackling across the 250,000 miles, reporting that they were go for descent. Mission control gave them permission to proceed. The astronauts looked at each other through the visors of their helmets, seeing their own nervous excitement reflected back. Then Armstrong's gloved hand moved to the controls, and the descent engine ignited, and they began their fall toward history. The lunar module shook slightly as the descent engine fired, a gentle vibration that the astronauts could feel through their feet and hands. They stood at their stations, held in place by harnesses, their faces pressed close to the small windows that gave them their only view of where they were going. The engine would burn for 12 minutes, slowing their orbital velocity, letting them fall in a carefully controlled arc toward the surface. Armstrong's eyes flickered between the windows and the instruments. Altitude, velocity, fuel remaining, engine thrust. Numbers that had to stay within narrow ranges, that told the story of whether they would land safely or crash. His right hand rested on the attitude controller, ready to take manual control if needed. His left hand was near the throttle. Every second counted now. Every decision mattered. Aldrin called out readings from the computer, his voice steady and calm. They were following the programmed trajectory perfectly, descending toward a point about 5 miles uprange from their intended landing site. The plan was to come in low and fast, then pitch up at the last moment so they could see where they were going, gliding the final distance to touchdown. Below them, the lunar surface was rushing past, gray and ancient and utterly alien. The sun, hanging low in the sky, cast long shadows that made every rock and crater stand out in sharp relief. There were no colors here, just shades of gray, from bright white to deep black. A monochrome world untouched by wind or rain or life. At Mission Control in Houston, hundreds of people held their collective breath. The flight controllers sat at their consoles, monitoring every aspect of the descent, ready to call an abort if anything went wrong. Michael Chen stood at the back of the room, his hands clenched, his eyes fixed on the displays showing the lunar module's altitude and velocity. This was the moment everything had been building toward. This was the moment that would succeed or fail. 6 minutes into the descent, alarms began sounding in the lunar module. The computer was overloaded, trying to process too much data. Armstrong and Aldrin exchanged quick glances, fighting down the instinctive surge of fear. Was this serious? Should they abort? Mission Control analyzed the alarms in seconds that felt like hours. The guidance officer made the call. The overloads were not critical. The computer was still functioning. They were go to continue. Armstrong acknowledged with a single word, his voice betraying no emotion, though his heart was racing. The lunar module pitched up as programmed, and suddenly Armstrong could see the landing site ahead. His eyes widened. They were overshooting. The computer was taking them to a crater the size of a football field, its edges littered with boulders as big as cars. There was no way they could land there safely. He would have to take manual control, had to find a better spot. "I'm going to fly over this," Armstrong said, his hand moving to the controller. He reduced their rate of descent and extended their flight, using precious fuel to skip past the crater, searching ahead for a clear area. Aldrin called out altitude and fuel remaining, the numbers dropping steadily. They had perhaps 90 seconds of fuel left. 60 seconds. 30. Armstrong's eyes scanned the surface, his test pilot instincts taking over. There, a relatively clear patch, mostly flat, scattered with small rocks, but nothing too large. It would have to do. He guided Eagle toward it, dropping now, the engine kicking up dust that sparkled in the harsh sunlight and obscured his view. The dust got thicker as they descended, and Armstrong lost sight of the surface. He was flying almost blind now, trusting his instruments, trusting his training, trusting his instincts honed over thousands of hours of flying. Aldrin's voice continued its steady cadence. 20 feet, 15, 10. In Mission Control, everyone had stopped breathing. The fuel gauge showed almost nothing left. If the engine quit now, they would fall the remaining distance. It probably wouldn't kill them, but it might damage the lunar module, might strand them on the moon with no way to leave. "Contact light," Aldrin said suddenly. A probe extending from one of Eagle's landing legs had touched the surface, triggering a blue light on the instrument panel. Armstrong immediately shut down the engine as trained. For one long second, the lunar module hung there, and then it settled onto the moon with a gentle bump. Silence filled the cabin. Armstrong and Aldrin looked at each other, then out the window at the gray landscape surrounding them. They had done it. They were on the moon. Armstrong keyed his microphone, and his voice, calm as always, carried back to Earth with the most understated message in history. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." At Mission Control, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Controllers who had been rigid with tension slumped in their chairs, grinning, shaking hands, slapping backs. The flight director lit a cigar, breaking the usual no-smoking rule, and nobody complained. Michael Chen found that he was crying again, tears of joy and relief streaming down his face. On the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin went through their post-landing checklist with mechanical precision, even though both men wanted nothing more than to stop and stare out the window at the alien landscape. They had to make sure Eagle was secure, had to prepare for a quick launch if something went wrong, had to get ready for what came next. And what came next was the moment that billions of people around the world were waiting for. What came next was the first steps on the surface of another world. What came next was the culmination of human dreams stretching back to the dawn of consciousness. To the first time, a primitive human looked up at the moon and wondered what it was. But first, they needed to rest. Mission Control wanted them to sleep before attempting the moonwalk, to be fresh and alert for the tasks ahead. Armstrong and Aldrin tried, lying in their hammocks in the cramped cabin, but sleep was impossible. They were on the moon. The moon. How could anyone sleep at a time like this? After a few hours, they gave up and radioed to Houston. Could they skip the rest period and go outside early? Mission Control consulted, considered, and finally agreed. The astronauts suited up, helping each other with the bulky backpacks that would provide oxygen and cooling during their time outside. They depressurized the cabin, opened the hatch, and Armstrong squeezed through, backing out carefully, feeling with his feet for the ladder. Neil Armstrong descended the ladder slowly, one rung at a time, his bulky spacesuit making every movement awkward. Through his helmet, he could see the footpad at the bottom of the lunar module's leg, resting firmly on the gray soil. Beyond it stretched the moonscape, ancient and empty and waiting. He paused on the bottom rung, hanging there for a moment, looking down at the surface just a few feet below. This was it, the moment. He moved his left boot off the ladder and planted it firmly on the moon's surface, feeling the crunch of the soil beneath his weight, feeling the strange lightness of the moon's 1/6 gravity. "That's one small step for man," Armstrong said, his voice crackling through the radio to the millions listening on Earth. "One giant leap for mankind." He stepped down with his right foot, and now he was standing on the moon, the first human being ever to do so. He looked around, turning slowly, taking it in. The landscape was stark and beautiful in its desolation. Small craters and rocks scattered across a flat plain, sharp shadows cast by the low sun. No movement anywhere, no wind, no sound except his own breathing and the faint hiss of his radio. The soil was fine like powder, but it had substance beneath it, firmer ground that held his weight. His boots left clear impressions, the treads marking the dust that had lain undisturbed for billions of years. Overhead, hanging in the black sky, was Earth, a bright blue and white sphere so much more colorful and alive than the gray moon. Buzz Aldrin followed his commander down the ladder, and soon both men stood on the surface, two explorers in bulky white suits, moving with the strange bouncing gait that the low gravity imposed. They felt light, buoyant, as if they could leap into the sky with barely an effort. Aldrin described it as magnificent desolation, and the phrase captured something essential about the place. It was magnificent in its austere beauty, desolate in its absolute lifelessness. They had tasks to perform, experiments to set up, samples to collect. They moved with purpose, but also with a sense of wonder that transcended their training. They planted the American flag, struggling slightly to push the pole into the harder ground, beneath the surface dust. The flag was held out by a horizontal rod, so it would appear to fly even in the airless environment, a symbolic gesture that carried meaning beyond politics. They set up a seismometer to measure moonquakes, unrolled a sheet of foil to collect particles from the solar wind, placed a laser reflector that scientists would use to measure the distance to the moon with incredible precision. Every movement was captured on film by the camera they had mounted on a tripod, sending ghostly black and white images back to Earth. Images that would be watched by more people than had ever watched anything in human history. Armstrong ventured out to the rim of a crater while Aldrin worked near the lunar module. Through his visor, Armstrong could see into the depths of the crater, its walls steep and shadowed. He took photographs, described what he saw, collected samples of rocks that looked different from the surface material. Every stone, every scoop of soil was a treasure, a key to understanding the moon's ancient history. The time passed quickly, too quickly. They had been given just over 2 hours for this first moonwalk, and the minutes slipped away as they worked. Their movements became more confident as they adapted to the low gravity, learning to walk and bend and work in their cumbersome suits. Aldrin at one point stopped his tasks and simply stood still, looking around at the alien landscape, letting himself feel the profound strangeness and wonder of where he was. The silence was absolute. The sky was black even though the sun was shining. The horizon was much closer than on Earth, curving away sharply because the moon is so much smaller. It was like being in a dream, beautiful and surreal, and utterly unlike anything he had experienced before. They collected rocks and soil samples, using tongs to pick them up, placing them carefully in bags. Each sample would be studied by scientists for years, analyzed in laboratories, revealing secrets about how the moon formed, how old it was, what it was made of. The astronauts were not just explorers, but also field geologists, trained to observe and collect and describe. Armstrong noticed that his movements kicked up dust that arced in perfect parabolas before falling back to the surface. There was no air to slow the particles, so they flew like tiny projectiles, following the pure geometry of ballistic motion. It was mesmerizing to watch, another small detail that emphasized how different this world was from Earth. The call came from Mission Control that it was time to return to the lunar module. The astronauts acknowledged, taking a few final photographs, collecting a few last samples. Neither wanted to leave. They could have stayed out here for hours more, exploring, discovering, experiencing this incredible place. But the life support systems in their backpacks had limits, and safety had to come first. They climbed back up the ladder, Armstrong going first, then Aldrin. They passed their sample bags through the hatch, then squeezed through themselves, careful not to damage their suits on the edges of the opening. Inside Eagle, they sealed the hatch and repressurized the cabin, hearing the hiss of air filling the space. When they could safely remove their helmets, they looked at each other and grinned like children who had just experienced the greatest adventure of their lives. They had walked on the moon. They had stood on alien soil. They had done something that humans had dreamed about for thousands of years. And remarkably, miraculously, they had done it safely. They rested for a few hours, this time managing to sleep despite their excitement. their bodies exhausted from the exertion of working in the bulky suits. While they slept, Michael Collins orbited overhead in the command module, watching the moonscape pass below, knowing his colleagues were down there somewhere, tiny specks on a vast landscape, the loneliest human beings who had ever lived, separated from him by 60 miles of vacuum and rock. The ascent engine fired with a jolt that pushed Armstrong and Aldrin back against their standing positions in the lunar module. They had been on the moon for 21 hours, and now it was time to leave. The engine had no backup. If it failed to light, they would be stranded forever, two humans buried on a world not their own. But the engine had been designed with exquisite care, tested thoroughly, and it did not fail. Eagle's upper stage separated from the descent stage that had brought them to the surface, leaving behind the lower half as the first human artifact on the moon. The ascent was automatic, controlled by the computer, and it went perfectly. They rose straight up at first, then pitched over, accelerating faster and faster, climbing back into orbit. Through the small windows, Armstrong and Aldrin watched the landing site fall away below them. They could see their footprints, dark marks in the gray soil, could see the equipment they had left behind, could see the shadow of Eagle racing across the surface as they climbed. Then the curve of the moon's horizon appeared, and they were back in space, weightless again, rising toward their rendezvous with Michael Collins and the command module. The rendezvous was a delicate dance of orbital mechanics. Collins had to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, and Eagle had to maneuver to match his position and velocity. The two spacecraft circled the moon, closing the distance between them, making small adjustments with their thrusters. Armstrong piloted Eagle with the precision of a master craftsman, watching Collins's spacecraft grow larger in the window. When they were close enough, Collins extended the docking probe, and Armstrong guided Eagle onto it. The two spacecraft came together with a satisfying clunk, latches engaging, sealing them into a single unit once more. The three astronauts were reunited, Collins welcoming his colleagues back with handshakes and smiles, eager to hear about their experience on the surface. They transferred the sample boxes through the tunnel, precious cargo containing rocks and soil from another world. Then Armstrong and Aldrin followed, pulling themselves through into the command module, leaving Eagle behind. They sealed the hatches, separated the two spacecraft, and watched as Eagle drifted away, its job complete. It would continue to orbit the moon for a while before eventually crashing back to the surface, another piece of human presence on that distant world. Now came the journey home. The command module's engine fired, breaking them free of lunar orbit, sending them falling back toward Earth. The moon receded behind them, growing smaller, returning to being a distant object in the sky. Ahead, Earth grew larger, its blues and whites and browns becoming more distinct as the hours passed. The return journey had a different quality than the outbound trip. The astronauts were more relaxed, the tension of the landing behind them. They had succeeded. They had walked on the moon and returned safely to orbit. Now, they just needed to get home. And while there were still dangers ahead, they felt a quiet confidence that they would make it. They took turns describing their experience on the surface to Collins, trying to find words for what it had been like. The strangeness of the low gravity, the beauty of the desolate landscape, the profound silence. The feeling of being so far from home, so utterly isolated, and yet so connected to everyone on Earth who was watching and hoping and celebrating with them. Collins listened with a mixture of envy and joy. He had not walked on the moon, but he had been part of the mission, an essential part. Without him, his colleagues could not have gotten home. He had done his job perfectly, and there was satisfaction in that, even if he sometimes wondered what it would have been like to step onto that alien surface. The three men settled into the routine of the return flight. They ate their space food, conducted their scheduled tasks, spoke with mission control about technical details, and gave interviews to journalists on Earth. They also spent long hours simply looking out the windows, watching Earth grow larger, feeling the pull of home become stronger. On the third day of the return journey, they prepared for re-entry. This was the most dangerous part of the entire mission. They would hit Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, and the friction would heat the spacecraft's heat shield to 5,000 degrees. If the heat shield failed, if the angle was wrong, if any of 100 things went wrong, they would burn up like meteors. They jettisoned the service module, the cylindrical section that had provided power and life support during the voyage, leaving only the cone-shaped command module. They checked and rechecked their orientation, making sure they would hit the atmosphere at exactly the right angle. Too steep, and they would burn up. Too shallow, and they would skip off the atmosphere like a stone on water, flying off into space with no way to get back. Mission Control wished them luck, and then the spacecraft entered the radio blackout zone, where the ionized gases created by re-entry would block all communications. For 4 minutes, the astronauts would be alone, cut off from Earth, riding a fireball through the sky, trusting that the heat shield would hold. The deceleration pressed them back into their couches, building from 1G to 4G to 6G. The windows glowed orange, then white, as the air around them turned to plasma. The spacecraft shook and groaned, protesting the violence of re-entry. The astronauts said nothing, focusing on their instruments, watching for any sign that something was going wrong. The heat and violence of re-entry seemed to last forever, though in reality it was just a few minutes. The astronauts felt the G-forces pressing them down, making it hard to breathe, making their arms feel like lead. Through the windows, all they could see was the orange glow of superheated plasma, like being inside a furnace, like riding a star down from heaven. And then, gradually, the shaking diminished. The glow outside the windows faded from white to orange to yellow to blue. The G-forces eased. They could hear the whistle of air rushing past the spacecraft, a sound they hadn't heard for 8 days, the sound of Earth's atmosphere embracing them and slowing their fall. "We're through," Armstrong said simply, and Collins keyed the radio to announce to Mission Control that they had survived re-entry and were once again in communication. The response from Houston was jubilant, voices crackling with relief and joy. The spacecraft was falling now under 3 huge parachutes, orange and white canopies that had deployed automatically, catching the air and slowing their descent to a gentle drift. Through the windows, the astronauts could see blue sky and white clouds, could see the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean below them, sunlight glittering on the waves. The world looked impossibly beautiful after the gray desolation of the moon. The blue was so vivid, the white so bright, the sight of water and clouds and living earth so precious. They were home. They had traveled farther than any humans in history. And they had come home. Recovery ships were already in position, aircraft carriers and helicopters waiting to pluck them from the ocean. The command module hit the water with a splash, bobbing upright on the waves. Inside, the astronauts felt the gentle rocking motion, so different from the stillness of space, so comforting and familiar. Navy divers jumped from helicopters into the water, swimming to the spacecraft, attaching a flotation collar to keep it stable. The hatch opened, and fresh sea air rushed in, smelling of salt and life and earth. The astronauts emerged one by one, helped into a raft, then lifted by helicopter to the aircraft carrier waiting nearby. They were placed immediately into quarantine, a precaution against the unlikely possibility that they had brought back some form of lunar microbe. Through the windows of the isolation facility, they could see sailors cheering, waving flags, celebrating the safe return of the heroes. The astronauts waved back, smiling, still not quite believing that they had really done it. On the ship, Michael Chen watched the recovery on closed-circuit television, tears streaming down his face. For the third time since the mission began, they had made it. Every system he had worked on had performed perfectly. Every calculation had been correct. Every risk had been managed. The astronauts were home safe. Around the world, people celebrated. In cities and towns and villages, in every country, on every continent, humans looked up at the moon that night and saw it differently. It was no longer an unreachable mystery. It was a place humans had visited, had walked upon, had touched with their own hands and feet. The impossible had become possible. The quarantine period lasted 3 weeks, during which doctors examined the astronauts thoroughly and found them healthy. The moon rocks were studied with intense interest, revealing that the moon was indeed ancient, about the same age as Earth, and that its surface had been geologically quiet for billions of years. There were no signs of life, no microbes, nothing but rock and dust, and the record of eons of meteorite impacts. When the astronauts were finally released from quarantine, they were greeted with parades and speeches and honors from around the world. But in quiet moments, each of them would think back to their time on the moon, to the experience of standing on that alien surface and looking up at Earth hanging in the black sky, and they would feel a profound sense of gratitude and wonder. In the months and years that followed, the impact of the moon landing rippled outward through human civilization, like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Children who watched the landing on television grew up to become scientists and engineers, inspired by what they had witnessed. Technologies developed for the space program found applications in medicine and communications and countless other fields. The famous photograph of Earth rising over the moon's horizon, taken during an earlier Apollo mission, became a symbol of environmental awareness, a reminder of how fragile and precious our planet is. Michael Chen continued working on the space program as more Apollo missions followed the first landing. Each one explored different regions of the moon, collected more samples, set up more experiments. Astronauts drove rovers across the lunar surface, traveled miles from their landing sites, discovered new features and formations. The scientific knowledge gained was immense, transforming our understanding of how the moon formed and how it has evolved over billions of years. But perhaps the greatest impact was more subtle, more profound. The moon landing proved that humans could accomplish seemingly impossible things when they worked together toward a common goal. It showed that our species was not bound to a single world, that we could venture out into the cosmos, that our future was not limited by the horizon we could see from Earth's surface. On quiet nights, Michael would still go up to his roof and look at the moon, just as he had done before the landing. But now, it felt different. Now he knew people who had been there. Now he could look at specific features and say, "That's where Neil and Buzz landed." Or, "That's where the next mission will go." The moon was no longer just a distant light. It was a place, a world, a destination. The Apollo program eventually ended, the last mission flying in 1972. Budget constraints and changing priorities brought the lunar expeditions to a close. And for decades afterward, no human ventured beyond low Earth orbit. But the achievement remained, recorded in history, preserved in photographs and films, and the memories of those who had witnessed it. The moon rocks brought back by the Apollo astronauts were distributed to laboratories and museums around the world. Michael went to see one on display at a museum, a small gray stone sitting on velvet in a protective case. People lined up to view it, to get as close as they could to something that had come from another world. Children pressed their faces against the glass, their eyes wide with wonder. Michael watched them and smiled. These children were growing up in a world where space travel was possible, where humans had walked on the moon, where the barrier between Earth and the cosmos had been breached. What would they accomplish in their lifetimes? What would their children accomplish? The moon landing was not an ending, but a beginning, the first step in a journey that would continue as long as humans existed. Years turned into decades, and the world changed in ways both large and small. Technology advanced at an accelerating pace. Computers that once filled entire rooms shrank to fit in people's pockets. The internet connected humanity in a web of information and communication that the Apollo engineers could hardly have imagined. New spacecraft ventured to Mars and Jupiter, to Saturn and beyond, sending back images of alien landscapes and distant moons. Michael Chen grew older, his hair turning gray and then white, his movements becoming slower and more careful. But his mind remained sharp, and his passion for space exploration never dimmed. He gave talks at schools and universities, sharing his experiences, encouraging young people to pursue careers in science and engineering. He always emphasized that the moon landing was not the achievement of a few brilliant individuals, but the work of thousands of people, each contributing their part to something greater than themselves. He would tell them about the seamstresses who sewed the spacesuits, about the janitors who kept the facilities clean, about the programmers who wrote code, and the technicians who assembled components. Every person mattered. Every job was important. The moon landing succeeded because people from all walks of life worked together with dedication and skill and care. Sometimes students would ask him what it felt like to be part of such a historic achievement. Michael would pause, thinking, trying to find words for something that was hard to express. "It felt," he would finally say, "like we were doing what humans were meant to do. We were reaching beyond ourselves, stretching toward something difficult and beautiful." We were proving that hope and effort and ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. He would talk about the moment when Armstrong's voice crackled across the distance saying, "The eagle has landed." He would describe the feeling of watching the live television feed from the moon's surface, seeing those ghostly images of suited figures moving in 1/6 gravity. He would tell them about the tears, the cheers, the sense that anything was possible if we worked hard enough and believed enough. "The moon landing taught us something important," he would say. "It taught us that we're capable of more than we think we are. It taught us that our differences are less important than our shared humanity. When we worked together toward a common goal, we achieved something magnificent." As he grew older, Michael would sometimes have dreams where he was on the moon himself, walking across the gray plains, feeling the crunch of lunar soil beneath his boots, looking up at Earth hanging in the black sky. In these dreams, he felt a profound peace, a sense of connection to something vast and timeless. He would wake with tears on his cheeks, not tears of sadness, but of gratitude for having lived in the time when humanity first stepped onto another world. The astronauts who walked on the moon also grew older, and one by one, they passed away, returning to the Earth that had been their home. But their footprints remained on the moon, preserved in the airless environment, unchanged by wind or rain, because there was no wind or rain. Those footprints would last for millions of years, a testament to human achievement, a memorial to the courage and dedication of those who ventured into the unknown. New generations came along who had not witnessed the moon landing firsthand, for whom it was just another historical event, no more immediate than Columbus sailing to America or Magellan circumnavigating the globe. But the achievement remained, inspiring those who learned about it, reminding humanity of what we could accomplish when we set our minds and hearts and hands to a worthy goal. On a quiet evening near the end of his long life, Michael Chen sat in a comfortable chair by his window, looking out at the sky as twilight deepened into night. His great-grandchildren had visited that afternoon, bright and energetic, full of questions about the space program and the moon landing. He had told them stories, shown them photographs, let them hold a small piece of a moon rock sample that had been given to him as a gift many years ago. The children had been amazed, their eyes wide as they carefully passed the stone from hand to hand, marveling that it had come from another world. "Is it heavy?" one had asked. "Does it feel different from Earth rocks?" Michael had smiled and explained that it was just a rock, chemically similar to volcanic rocks on Earth, but the fact that it came from the moon made it special, made it precious, made it a tangible link to that distant place. Now the children were gone, back to their own homes, and Michael sat alone in the gathering darkness. The moon was rising, as it had done every night of his life, as it had done for billions of years before he was born, and would continue to do for billions of years after he was gone. It was nearly full, bright, and serene, casting its silvery light through the window. Michael thought about all the years since the landing, all the changes he had witnessed, all the progress and setbacks and triumphs. Humanity had accomplished so much, yet so much remained to be done. There were still wars and poverty and injustice on Earth. There were still problems that seemed insurmountable, divisions that seemed impossible to bridge. But the moon landing proved that humans could overcome great challenges when they chose to. It proved that we could work together, that we could achieve the impossible, that we could reach for the stars and actually touch them. That lesson, Michael thought, was perhaps the most important legacy of Apollo 11. He felt his eyes growing heavy, a pleasant drowsiness settling over him like a warm blanket. The moon's light seemed to grow softer, more gentle, bathing the room in a peaceful glow. He thought about the astronauts sleeping in the lunar module after their moonwalk, exhausted but fulfilled, resting on the surface of another world before beginning their journey home. He thought about the quiet moments of the mission, the times when the astronauts simply floated and looked out the windows at the vast beauty of space. Michael's breathing slowed and deepened. He felt at peace, connected to the universe in a way that was hard to articulate, but deeply felt. The moon was still there, still shining, still orbiting Earth in its eternal dance. And somewhere up there, preserved in the airless environment, were the footprints and equipment left behind by those brave explorers, silent witnesses to humanity's first tentative steps into the cosmos. He thought about all the people who had contributed to the moon landing, all the lives that had touched the mission in ways large and small. The engineers and astronauts, yes, but also the families who supported them, the taxpayers who funded the program, the children who watched in wonder and carried that inspiration throughout their lives. It had been a collective achievement in the truest sense, a moment when humanity came together to do something extraordinary. The moon's light seemed to fill the room now, soft and peaceful, like a lullaby made visible. Michael felt himself drifting, floating, light as a feather. He imagined he was in space, weightless and free, looking down at Earth from above. The planet was so beautiful, so perfect, spinning slowly in the darkness, blue and white and alive. Home, the most precious place in the universe, the cradle of humanity, the world that had given birth to consciousness and art and science and love. His eyes closed, and he was still smiling. In his mind, he could see the moon clearly, could see its craters and mountains and vast empty plains. He could see the Earth rising over the lunar horizon, that iconic image that had changed how humanity saw itself. We were not separate nations or peoples. We were one species living on one small planet, traveling together through the cosmos on a journey we were only beginning to understand. The moon would continue to orbit Earth, pulling the tides, marking the months, shining its reflected light on sleeping continents and dreaming oceans. And perhaps, someday, humans would return to walk on its surface again. Perhaps they would build bases there, cities under protective domes, settlements that would look up at Earth and feel the same wonder that the first astronauts felt looking back at their home world. But that was for future generations to accomplish. Michael's generation had shown it was possible. They had taken the first step. They had proved that the boundary between Earth and the rest of the universe was not a wall, but a doorway, waiting to be opened, waiting to be crossed. The moon continues its ancient journey around Earth, just as it has for billions of years. It pulls the tides with its gentle gravity. It lights the night with its reflected glow. It marks the passage of time with its changing phases. And on its surface, in a place called the Sea of Tranquility, there are footprints. These footprints were made on July 20th, 1969, by two human beings who traveled farther from home than anyone had ever gone before. The footprints are still there, unchanged, perfectly preserved in the airless environment. They will remain there for millions of years, long after the people who made them have returned to the dust of Earth, long after the civilizations that sent them have transformed into something new and unimaginable. But the footprints are more than just marks in lunar soil. They are symbols of human courage and curiosity, of our endless drive to explore and discover and understand. They remind us that we are capable of achieving things that seem impossible, that we can overcome our differences and work together toward common goals, that our future is not limited by the horizon we can see from where we stand. Every night when the moon rises, those footprints catch the light of the sun and cast tiny shadows on the gray surface. No one can see them from Earth. They are far too small. But knowing they are there changes how we see the moon. It is no longer an unreachable mystery, but a place that humans have visited, a world we have touched with our own hands. And so we rest, we dreamers and explorers, we children of Earth who look up at the stars and wonder what lies beyond. We rest knowing that the universe is vast and full of wonders waiting to be discovered. We rest knowing that humans have already taken the first steps into that vast expanse. We rest knowing that the same moon that lights our sleep has felt the pressure of human feet, has heard human voices, has been touched by human hands. The moon shines down on a sleeping world, on cities and forests, on mountains and oceans, on all the diversity of life that makes Earth so precious and unique. It shines on children dreaming of adventures among the stars, on scientists planning future missions, on everyone who has ever looked up and wondered what it would be like to travel to distant worlds. And in that gentle light, in the peace of night, we can rest, knowing that we are part of something larger than ourselves. We are part of a species that dreams, that explores, that reaches beyond itself toward the infinite. We are part of the ongoing story of humanity's journey into the cosmos, a journey that began with those first footprints on the moon and will continue as long as humans exist. So sleep now under the light of the moon, knowing that you are connected to all who came before and all who will come after. Sleep knowing that the impossible is possible, that dreams can come true, that humanity's greatest achievements come from hope and courage and working together toward a common purpose. Sleep in peace, bathed in the gentle light of the moon, that faithful companion that has watched over Earth since the dawn of time and will continue to watch long after we are gone. Sleep and dream of stars and distant worlds, of adventures yet to come, of all the wonders that await us in the infinite expanse of the cosmos. The moon shines on, eternal and serene, and under its peaceful light we rest, we dream, we sleep.